Welcome to part 2 of 4 of the Halifax Explosion, the explosion and silence from Halifax.
At approximately 5 minutes past 9 in the morning on December 6th, 1917, close to 6 million pounds of explosives on board the Mont Blanc detonated. The explosion caused 3 major forces to be released: a tidal wave tsunami, an earthquake-like ground shaking, and an extreme wind pressure from the explosion that caused most of the destruction. With a thundering roar, the exploding chemicals rocked Halifax and Dartmouth with violence. In 1/50th of a second, the Mont Blanc vanished into a searing ball of flames, and gases shot up 1,000 feet into the initial ball of fire until most of it vaporized. The ship, the Acadian, was 15 miles out of Halifax and making good speed on that sunny but cold December morning. Suddenly, the scene was interrupted by a flash of light brighter than the sun. An immense cloud of smoke shot up in the air in the direction of Halifax, which was followed by a crimson ball of rolling flames. A few seconds later, the crew then heard the sound of an explosion. The billowing smoke rose higher and higher, and the captain grabbed his sextant that showed the cloud had risen to more than 12,000 feet. The wind pushed the cloud of smoke southeast. 52 miles out to sea, the USS Tacoma was on a return leg of its third transatlantic escort and was not scheduled to stop in Halifax, but upon seeing the rising cloud from the distance, the captain thought something must be wrong. Half an hour behind came the USS von Steuben. Watching the billowing smoke from the bridge, its captain also assumed that something extraordinary must have happened. Both ships sped towards Halifax. A fishing boat crew arriving in Boston mentioned hearing a low boom rumbling across the sea. The explosion disintegrated the Mont Blanc into fragments and mostly the size of needle, which rained down on the city. Only a couple of pieces of the Mont Blanc were large enough to still be recognizable. The shaft of the anchor, 5 feet 9 inches, weighing over 1,200 pounds, was hurled westward over the city and embedded itself 4 feet into the ground in the northwest arm, almost 2.5 miles from the explosion. And the barrel of the stern of the cannon traveled in the opposite direction. It came to rest in the wooded section of Dartmouth, almost 3 miles away. It had been estimated that the force of the explosion was moving at 4 miles per second, or about 14,000 miles per hour. Experts gauged that the initial blast of air was traveling at 23 times the speed of sound. The air blast blew through the streets, toppling buildings and crashing through windows, doors, walls, and chimneys. People a half a mile away from the ship were smashed by the pressure before they heard the sound of the blast. Close to the explosion center, churches, schools, shops, factories, and houses alike caved in or burst into clouds of flying wreckage. In fewer than 8 seconds after the blast, more than 1,000 people were dead. In the next few days, another 1,000 would die. 9,000 sustained injuries. The number of those immediately homeless numbered about 25,000 of the 60,000 residents of Halifax. The Acadian sugar refinery was 500 feet from the Mont Blanc. All 60 employees were killed. The Hollis foundry had 75 employees working that day, and of them 73 were killed. Masses of debris were flung high into the air and then caught in a whirlwind. Wooden buildings were blown away in an instant, and those of concrete crumbled and fell. Many were killed instantly, but not everyone. Barbara Orr was far enough away, and she survived the explosion, although the blast rendered her unconscious. She was picked up by a soldier and carried to a distance from the street. When she came her bewilderment, she remembers everyone screaming, "It's the Germans." More on this later. Those who did survive suffered from shock. Parents stood before the ruins of their home, screaming the names of their children who would never again come to their call. Some children sat in rubble, crying for their parents who would never again arrive to comfort them. In an instant, all city services and utilities away from the devastated area ground to a halt. Trees were uprooted, telegraph and telephone poles snapped like matches. Overhead power cables were pulled apart and sparked fiercely, leaving the city unable to communicate with the outside world. Pier 6 was gone completely, and the other piers were massive jumbles of debris. Nearly every ship in the harbor was tossed around by the explosion, and then by the tidal wave that followed. As mentioned, the Emu, weighing over 5,000 tons at a length of 430 feet, was tossed onto the Dartmouth shore. The SS Cologne was in port picking up horses to take to Europe for the war, and 37 of its crew were killed. The sister ship of the Titanic, the Olympic, was in the harbor, but far enough away to survive the blast. It contained 5,000 Chinese workers who were on their way to Europe. Ships awaiting convoy to the war were not allowed to disembark their passengers, so that probably saved the lives of these Chinese workers. Immediately following the blast came a tsunami, a tidal-like wave from the harbor which washed over the rubble. Massive amounts of debris, including dead bodies, were then washed back into the harbor and by the returning waves. The harbor was littered with wreckage and bodies for days, with corpses still being recovered along the shoreline a week later. Others were washed out to sea, never to be recovered. The tidal wave also crashed against the Dartmouth side with incredible force. Houses were swamped, and shanties and wigwams of the Micmac Indians were obliterated. Ironically, all but one of the Mount Blanc's crew had survived after rowing to safety on the Dartmouth shore. Some of the Emu crew had survived, but all on the bridge were killed except one. After the water from the tidal wave receded from both shores, Halifax and Dartmouth continued burning as fires spread. A rising column of smoke now rose to 3 miles in the sky. Every building within a mile was severely damaged. The collapsed houses and overturned wood and coal-burning kitchen stove set fires to the ruins. Houses caught fire much like kindling. There was no available means to extinguish the fires. Rescue of those under the houses was extremely difficult. Speed was essential because of the rapidly spreading fires. In many cases, whole families had to be left where they were to burn to death, because others could be gotten to more easily and quickly. Many rescuers were sick at having to abandon so many people. One rescuer was quoted as saying he regretted not having his revolver with him, as at least he could have spared some further pain and suffering. Parts of Halifax burned for more than a week, fueled by the winter's load of coal contained in the basement bins, burning many to death and removing all traces of the occupants. The majority of the bodies eventually recovered in the Richmond area of Halifax were charred by fire, many to the point of being unrecognizable. In some of these photos, taken far enough from the epicenter of the explosion to allow the structures to be still standing, you'll see buildings with protruding walls rather than walls pushed in. The extra low pressure created a vacuum after the high pressure blast of air went by at over 14,000 miles per hour, causing air within the homes to explode, forcing the walls outward. Roofs and ceilings collapsed on top of their owners. Floors dropped into the basements and trapped families under timber beams and furniture. In those buildings that did not collapse from the explosion, windows were pounded into vicious dagger blades and needle-sized splinters into a swirling blizzard of shattered glass. The glass spared few, especially anyone unlucky enough to be still standing in front of the window while watching the burning ships below in the harbor. Many people reported passing out, while others who had been watching the fire seconds before woke to find themselves unable to see. This is a map of the blast zone with the most devastation. There was hardly a pane of glass left intact in the entire city. Windows were broken more than 50 miles away. My grandmother told me that my grandfather, then age 12, was out in his yard splitting wood that morning 150 miles north of Halifax and heard the explosion. At the nearby rail yard, freight and passenger cars were hurled up and onto the road and across the harbor. 3 miles of rail and twisted track were intertwined with the wreckage of freight cars and over 100 passenger cars that were pulverized into splinters. The regular Boston train to Halifax, which had been running late, felt the shock of the explosion in Rockingham, Nova Scotia, tilting some of the cars. The train inched as far into the city as it could before stopping where they saw the first survivors. The conductor then decided to fill the train with as many wounded as he could and take them out of the city and back to Truro. 3 children died en route. Some residents who were away from the city returned home that night could neither find their home nor the street in the destruction. George Graham, the general manager of the Nova Scotia Railway, had spent the night in his private rail car at the North Street station when the yard rocked and shuddered. Outside, almost 400 ruined rail cars surrounded him, and some of them were still on fire. Others were tipped over, and others smashed flat. When he tried to send a telegram from his Halifax office, he learned that all of the wires were down, so he set off on foot. He walked and ran 3 miles from Halifax to the Rockingham station and counted 25 of his dead railroad workers along the way. From Rockingham, he sent a blast telegraph.
Organize a relief train and send word to Wolfville and Windsor to round up all doctors, nurses, and Red Cross supplies possible to obtain. No time to explain details, but list of casualties is enormous.
But beginning at 9:26 a.m., other telegrams began flickering between other areas of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Ottawa, Montreal, Boston, and New York. The telegrams mentioned a collision, a possible fire, and an explosion, and several deaths, and that the city was cut off from the rest of the world. All wire communication with Halifax to the outside points had been severed. Dr. McGrath of Kentville, Nova Scotia, eventually received word of the telegram, and they immediately boarded the next train to Halifax. Upon arriving in Rockingham, they had to disembark and walk the rest of the way because the track was so twisted. They struggled through the debris, which had just started being cleared by the military. Dr. McGrath later wrote that bodies were stacked like cordwood on both sides of the street, with fires burning all around. Truro, Nova Scotia, 60 miles from Halifax, was rocked by the explosion. Dishes fell from cupboards, and horses rushed wildly into the streets. To get people out of the city, the Dominion Atlantic Railway offered free train passage for anyone waiting to leave the city. By the night of December 7th, 400 homeless and injured had been relocated to Truro. George Graham's wireless message was soon picked up by operators along the eastern seaboard. A bank in Boston received the telegram that Graham had sent on the private banking wire about 2 hours after the explosion. the banker called on Henry Endicott, chairman of the Massachusetts Committee on Public Safety. Endicott suggested that they take it to the governor at the State House. When Governor Samuel McCall read the telegram, he did not know what had happened or what Halifax needed, but he knew he had to act. He then dispatched his own telegram addressed to Mayor Martin of Halifax.
Understand your city in danger from explosion and conflagration. Reports only fragmentary. Massachusetts ready to go to the limit and render every assistance you may be in need of. Wire me immediately.
Expecting to hear back soon, he called a meeting of the Committee on Public Safety for later that day. In the afternoon meeting attended by 100 men, Governor McCall told the group that there had been no contact with the city of Halifax since he sent his message. He instructed Endicott to contact the U.S. Department of War and the Department of Navy to see if they had any news. Endicott returned shortly to say that no one from Halifax had contacted either department. Although still unsure what had happened, Colonel William Brooks, the acting Surgeon General of the Commonwealth, stood up and suggested that if they could get a train, he could dispatch corps of surgeons, doctors, and nurses and supplies within a few hours. When the question came up where they would get the train, James Houston from the Boston and Maine Railroad stood and offered one of his. Governor McCall asked if it could be ready by 10 o'clock that night. Houston promised the train would be waiting on the platform. Governor McCall then named J.C. Rachesky to be the commissioner in charge of the Halifax Relief Expedition and wrote a letter of introduction to the mayor of Halifax. McCall went back to his office and dictated another telegram.
Since sending my telegram this morning offering unlimited assistance, an important meeting of citizens has been held, and Massachusetts stands ready to offer aid in any way you can avail yourself of it. We are prepared to send forward immediately a special train with surgeons, nurses, and other medical assistants, but await advice from you.
Still no reply, as much of Halifax remained isolated from all communication. Because the telegraph wires were severed by the explosion, Governor McCall's offers to help were published in the Calgary, Alberta newspaper before they received in other parts of Halifax. The USS Tacoma, that had seen the rising cloud of smoke at sea that morning, finally got to the harbor at 2 p.m. The captain came to Halifax's City Hall that evening to ask if he could provide any assistance to the city. Halifax officials immediately took him up on his offer and asked if he could provide 250 soldiers to patrol the city that night so that the Halifax police and Canadian Mounties could get some rest. He obliged within minutes. Still not receiving a reply, the governor sent a third message.
Realizing that time is of the utmost importance, we have not waited for your answer to dispatch the train.
On that Thursday night of the explosion, 13 medical professionals and 6 Red Cross disaster workers left Boston by train at 10 p.m. The special relief train had the right of way, taking advantage of its privileged status to pass the regular Boston train. Normal passage took 27 hours, but they wanted to cut 5 hours off the journey. The train made excellent time through New Hampshire into Maine until Waterville, where it was forced to stop as 5 freight cars in front of it had derailed. They had to wait over an hour before they could proceed through northern Maine into the province of New Brunswick. Rumors had already made their way to New Brunswick that something terrible had happened, and those with relatives in Halifax were standing on the local station platforms hoping for a train to come through to take them there. This further slowed down the relief train. The rumors were enough to make the relief workers rightly believe that they did not have enough supplies, so they decided to stop in St. John's, New Brunswick, 2 hours away, to pick up more. When they reached St. John's, they finally learned more about the true extent of the disaster. It was worse than anyone had ever imagined. Kate McMahon of the American Red Cross wrote, "At every stop, we learned the size and consequences of the disaster, and it increases. Leaving St. John's, they were now in the midst of a blizzard."
Thank you for watching Part 2 of the Halifax Explosion story. Stay tuned for Part 3, Snowdrifts and the Massachusetts Response.